Adolf Hitler spent the last 12 days of his life in a bunker underneath the Chancellery of the Reich. Here on the 30th of April 1945, the dictator put an end to his own life.
It was evident that he was a man without hope.
Hoffnungsloser Mann vor allem steht.
Unwilling to face the consequences that defeat would bring, the dictator planned his end without any consideration for his desperate nation. An inconspicuous parking lot by a council apartment building just a few hundred meters away from Potsdamer Platz. Here in the center of Berlin, Adolf Hitler had set up his last place of refuge 8 meters below the ground, protected by his Praetorian Guard and by 4-meter thick concrete walls. In April 1945, he gathered his closest aides around him. This 250 square meter concrete coffin was the control room from which he commanded millions of German soldiers until the end, and rallied his nation with appeals to hold out. By the 16th of April 1945, the Red Army had assembled 500,000 Soviet soldiers at the Oder River with the objective of taking the Reich capital. The large-scale offensive began at 3 o'clock that morning. Mortars and Stalin Orgel were firing relentlessly. The Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov directed the battle from his command post. Despite some initial setbacks for his army, he was confident that the days of the Third Reich were numbered.
Hitler's regime was in an absolutely hopeless situation. It was evident for everyone, for the dictator himself, of course, since he had the best overview of the situation, but also for the simple man who was trying to get away from the war and had become a refugee, and for the average soldier who fought for survival, that this was the final act. One must also consider that for large parts of the Reich, for large parts of the German population, the war was already over. Only on paper, and if one wanted to, could one still gloss over the situation on the maps in the Führer's headquarters. On paper, and this may have been a glimmer of hope for some people, things didn't look so bad for the Wehrmacht. On paper, it still encompassed over 10 million men.
Hitler's soldiers had long become war-weary. However, their oath to the Führer bound them. The few troops that were still fit for action had fortified the capital in order to ward off the attack. Although most cinemas had closed long ago, propaganda cameramen were still on the road for the Nazi newsreels. This absurd interview was shot somewhere near the Oder front. It was supposed to boost confidence back at home. Hey fellows, you built a nice villa here.
You can say that again, it's not bad.
So where are you from?
I'm from Berlin Charlottenburg.
Oh, from Berlin Charlottenburg, are you?
Yes, sir.
Does your wife know you're here then?
Well, at the moment she's not sure.
Really?
She has to get away. She must be somewhere near Lübeck.
Well, then we have to make sure that she sees you again.
Yes, hopefully she'll see me here.
Yes, look, Mum, your boy is fine. What about the Russians? They leave you in peace here, don't they?
Oh, well, it's not too bad. I think they're more scared than we are.
Absolutely. The Führer had already decided at the beginning of March 1945 to await the attack of the Red Army in Berlin. The story began on the 20th of April, Hitler's 56th birthday. Five and a half years of war had left their mark on Hitler. Still, he refused to accept the imminent defeat.
Hitler was a wreck physically. He was ill and looked totally different to the man I remembered from the newsreels.
noch nie von nahem gesehen hatte ihn in der Vorstellung, so wie ich ihn in den Wochenschauen gesehen
On film, he was an
eben als
upright,
eine
erect figure, vigorous and robust as he inspected parades hour after hour. And even towards the end, he would stand there erect, just like before, as if all that was happening didn't matter at all.
Also aufrecht da, als ob ihm das gar nichts ausmachen würde. Und deswegen war es für mich also
So I was totally shocked when I saw him in person for the first time.
mit einem gebeugten Rücken,
His back was bowed, his face was sallow, and his eyes were dull.
man immer gehört, die strahlenden Augen.
Before, people had always talked about Hitler's glittering eyes that made such an impression. His left hand was shaking, and when it was lying on the table, he would cover it with his right, so that people didn't notice it. And he also dragged his left leg. The man was a
Es
wreck.
war ein Wrack, den man dort eben sah.
On that day, 20th of April, the dictator went to the garden of the Chancellery in order to honor members of the Hitler Youth.
Am 20. April waren
Three delegations were present on that day. Hitler came out with his entourage without wearing a coat, which was unlike his known normal appearance, a coat with a turned-up collar. He had only an army jacket on, and his left arm was behind his back, the hand holding onto the jacket's tail.
Da hatte den linken Arm und hielt sich dann an seinem eigenen Rock fest. Und Hitler
He was shaking badly.
heimlich. Und dann
And then he came and looked me in the eye, and I could see that his eyes were watering.
eben, dass die verdreht waren. Und dann, als alle
After he had greeted
begrüßt hat,
everyone, he stood before us and gave us a short speech in which he said, the Reich could be compared with a critically ill patient, but he would now give it a new medicine which would be ready soon and which would save us.
kranken Patienten zu vergleichen, aber es würde jetzt noch ein Medikament geben, das bald fertig sei und das uns retten
And
würde.
we would have to hold out now until the medicine was ready and could be used to save the Reich.
Medikament fertig ist und angewandt werden können, das Reich zu retten.
Briefing had been a daily ritual since the beginning of the war. After Hitler's arrival in Berlin, it would take place in the Chancellery of the Reich. Now, in view of the military situation, the briefing was transferred to the Führer's bunker for safety reasons.
Das Lagerzimmer war entsprechend
Because of the small dimensions of the bunker, due to the thick reinforced concrete walls, the briefing room was tiny, just 3.5 by 3.5 meters.
War das winzig klein eigentlich. Es waren nur 350 mal 350 Meter und bestand eigentlich.
All there was in the room was a table, also relatively small, on which the maps were spread out during the briefing, and a chair on which Hitler sat.
Lagerbesprechung.
All the others had to stand. There was no space for anything
Und
else.
einem Stuhl, auf dem Hitler saß. Alle anderen mussten stehen. Da war kein Platz für weitere Bequemlichkeiten.
Hitler's generals did not dare to contradict their commander. He entertained fantasies of imminent counter-campaigns.
Hatte immer an sich immer wieder den Eindruck, dass
One actually had the impression that he had full control of his mental powers, that he had fixed ideas.
Aber war eben erstarrt. Hatte eine starre Linie.
He had a rigid line which he pursued, and he would not let anyone persuade him otherwise.
Von den Führern, die
He would
vor
not
Ort
listen
waren
to the
und
suggestions of the
die
commanders who were at the front and who knew the conditions,
auch für ihre Männer Vorschläge
and
machen,
bearing the responsibility for their men,
für eine
wanted
bessere
better and more
und
flexible combat conduct.
Gefechtsführung.
He remained
Und,
stubborn.
da blieb
Once he had made a decision, he
stur
always
und
followed it
wenn er
through
einmal
doggedly.
einen Entschluss gefasst hatte, der wurde dann auch von ihm konsequent verfolgt.
Scattered Wehrmacht and SS troops were to halt the attack. Juvenile soldiers filled the ranks. It was evident that those units were unable to start an effective counterattack.
Von Hitler angefangen bis zum letzten Adjutanten wussten die, der Krieg
From
ist
Hitler to the
verloren.
last
Die
aide,
Frage
they
ist nur,
all
wie
knew
geht
the
er
war
zu
was
Ende und
lost.
wann geht er zu Ende.
What was unclear
Es war
was
völlig
how and when
klar,
it would end.
er würde nicht
It was
in
obvious that
der
Hitler would not be the one to
Weißen
approach the enemy with a white flag, especially not the Russians. He therefore staged, so to speak, this final campaign. He was still able to keep a hold over his environment and control the commanders of his army. He sent out his orders via telephone and radio, but on the lower hierarchy levels, every general basically conducted his own war in whichever way he saw fit. And Hitler could then see on the field map and from the reports that despite his orders, the fronts had broken down and all the hopes he had placed on them were shattered.
Auf die noch natürlich bis in die letzten Tage hinein gesetzt hat, zerbrachen.
On the morning of the 21st of April 1945, the Soviets crossed the Berlin motorway ring road. Their objective was now within reach: to encircle the Reich capital and cut off Hitler's supply routes. Soviet artillery had begun shelling the city. The citizens of Berlin had somehow managed to get used to the Allied air raids, but now the Russian shells were hitting the city center without prior warning. In the Führerbunker, Hitler's secretaries were woken up by the Soviet shells.
Of course, we were asking how long the war would last and when it would end. But he always gave us a standard answer. When we have won, we must win, and we will. It went like this until the end. The aides would always tell us, don't burden the Führer with insistent questions that are odious to him.
The Wehrmacht was in a state of total disorder. Communication to the headquarters had been temporarily cut off. Hitler demanded the concentration of the scattered units. His orders were unmistakable. Retreating to the west is forbidden for all units. Officers who do not obey these instructions unconditionally are to be arrested and executed immediately. (22nd of April 1945). Despite the fierce resistance, the Soviets were capturing the suburbs of Berlin. House-to-house fighting began. At the briefing at 1500 hours, Hitler was faced with the realization that no one could obey his orders any longer. The counterattack he had demanded turned out to be pie in the sky.
Das ist die einzige Lagerbesprechung gewesen, bei der Hitler die Order gab, was sonst niemals vorgekommen war.
That was the only briefing at which Hitler ordered all the young officers and aides to leave the room. It had never happened before. The only people who stayed with him were Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bormann, the party secretary, and General Burgdorf, who was the Wehrmacht's chief aide with Hitler. I only know that Hitler had a breakdown and admitted for the first time that the war was lost, which he had never done before in public or even within the circle of the briefing.
Verloren ist, was vorher nie öffentlich oder vor dem Kreis der Lagerbesprechung zugegeben hat und aber dann auch gleich wieder in einen Wutanfall.
Afterwards, however, he had a tantrum and accused the army and the generals of not really backing him or showing full commitment and of failing.
Nicht wirklich hinter ihm gestanden hätte und versagt hätte und sich nicht voll eingesetzt hätte.
Dass ein Mann dann so psychisch zusammenbricht, dass
It's bizarre that the man broke down mentally and finally spoke out what everyone had actually been waiting to hear for 3 years, that the war was lost. The whole world knew that the Germans had lost the war a long time ago. He knew it too. He was probably the first to realize it, perhaps as early as in December 41. but he only said it now. Voicing these words was like signing his own death sentence. But it also meant that the people around him were suddenly free to go. Everyone was able to leave now, maybe to Berchtesgaden. Everyone was looking for a way out. All of a sudden they could talk about it openly, how to get out of besieged Berlin. This was another aspect of Hitler's admission of defeat. Everyone could take flight except him.
Dabei wurde natürlich auch die Frage diskutiert.
Of course, the issue of where he would stay was also discussed. The actual tendency among the people in his entourage was to persuade him to move to Bavaria, to the so-called fortress in the Alps, and fight the final battle from there. But he rejected this idea absolutely. He said that he would stay in the Reich capital, and if it came down to it, fall in the capital too.
I think that the officers and the other participants in the military briefings had surely known already that things could not end well. I, however, was blindly confident for some reason. I just couldn't imagine that someone would first say, "We will win, we must win, there is no other possibility, we must defeat Bolshevism, we are the only bulwark against Bolshevism," and the next admit, "We've lost everything, it's all over."
Since Hitler had taken Eva Braun as his lover, he had kept the young woman out of the public eye. Against his will, she now came from Obersalzberg to the bunker in Berlin. Her time had now come.
She was naturally aware of the hopelessness of her relationship with the Führer, and also of the inevitable fact that she would die with him. And she never took these things lightly. Her decision was admirable. I had the feeling that she did it because during her entire life she had always been standing in the background, and she would probably never get a chance to change that. She must have thought that she would then at least go down in history as the Führer's heroic lover. I believe it was this idea that gave her the strength.
Heroische Geliebte, die Frau des Führers. Ich glaube, das war ihre Vorstellung, die ihr Kraft gegeben hat.
Many people only found out about a woman being at Hitler's side in those last few days. One of them was Armin Lehmann. Meeting Eva Braun for the first time in the bunker was a surprise to him.
Die Eva Braun, sie sah wie eine Filmschauspielerin.
Eva Braun looked like an actress when I met her down in the bunker. I remember she was wearing a long, dark blue or black dress and a golden brooch. She looked young and very pretty.
On that day, the Goebbels family decided to link their destiny with that of Hitler.
Da sah ich mit einem Mal, dass da eine sehr elegante Dame, also nicht mehr ganz jung, aber sehr gut ausschauend, herunterkam, und ich erkannte, dass das also Frau Goebbels war. Und dahinter kamen die 6
I saw a very elegant lady, not the youngest, but still looking very good, come down the stairs and recognized it was Frau Goebbels, with her 6 children behind her, all wearing little dark coats, because it was still cold outside. I will never forget the fear on their small pale faces protruding from the collars of their coats as they came down into the bunker. And then it dawned on me, and it came as such a huge shock that I remember to this day that these children most probably would not get out of this bunker alive again.
Wo ziemlich sicher war, dass diese Kinder diesen Bunkerleben nie mehr verlassen würden.
For the First Lady of the Third Reich, a fervent National Socialist, the fact that her 6 children would die with her was a foregone conclusion.
Zu deinem Geburtstag, weil du meist fort in wichtigen Sachen und oft nicht weißt, was wir dann machen. Soll dir dies Buch nun all das zeigen, was hier geschah im bunten Reich.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels organized the total warfare at the home front. In a last broadcast address, he stylized his wife and children as examples for the Germans.
Ich bleibe mit meinen Mitarbeitern selbstverständlich in Berlin. Auch meine Frau und meine Kinder sind hier und bleiben hier. Mit allen Mitteln werde ich die Verteidigung der Reichshauptstadt aktivieren. Mein Denken und Handeln gilt eurem Wohl und der Abwehr unseres gemeinsamen Feindes.
On the 23rd of April, Soviet troops penetrated into the northern and eastern outskirts of Berlin. These pictures were taken in the Weissensee district. While the post-Hitler era had already begun here, a few kilometers away he still refused to capitulate, and no one could change his mind.
Das war eine Maschine, die rollte, die konnte man ein Einzelner nicht aufhalten.
He was like a machine that rolled and which could not be stopped by one man alone. At least not as long as his powerful mind worked, and it did work up until the end. Because he didn't break mentally, he was just physically weakened, but his mental powers were intact up until the end.
The Minister for Armaments of Nazi Germany, Albert Speer, had maintained the combat strength of the Wehrmacht month after month. Forced laborers and concentration camp inmates toiled in his factories under inhuman conditions, and Speer had no mercy. Yet when Hitler demanded the destruction of the German industries in March 1945, the minister refused to obey these orders. In this context, it is unclear why Albert Speer risked his life on the 23rd of April when he visited Hitler in his bunker to say goodbye. Maybe it was a game with high stakes.
Es gab nur einen Mann in Deutschland, der über den
There was only one man in Germany who could not and would not think about what would happen after the end of the war, and this man was Hitler. Everyone else knew and accepted that. There was a struggle going on between a man who knows that the day the war ends will be the day he dies, whatever that day might be, and his human instinctive need to postpone this day, this hour, as far as possible. The fact that millions of Germans might perish was of no importance to him at all.
Hitler heedlessly allowed tens of thousands of soldiers and Home Guard men to die in the house-to-house fighting in Berlin. Those who could left the city and took flight to the west. The disintegration of the last contingents was a matter of days, and not only in Berlin. Everywhere across the Reich, German soldiers were taken prisoner en masse. In the face of the final defeat, the old companions were now abandoning their Führer too. While Hitler was meeting with Speer, a wire from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring arrived at the Führerbunker.
Es verbreitete sich natürlich sofort, also wie ein Lauffeuer, im ganzen Bunker. Leute hatten ja alle nichts zu tun, und wenn da so eine Neuigkeit kam, dann wusste
The
das
news
dann auch
spread
sehr
immediately
schnell
like
jeder.
wildfire over the entire bunker. The soldiers had nothing to do, of course, so if there was any news, everyone would soon know about it. The general opinion about this wire was that it was outrageous to give Hitler such a short ultimatum. It said that if he didn't answer in a few hours, the executive power in the Reich would be transferred to Göring and Hitler would be deposed.
paar Stunden eben antworten, dass eben die vollziehende Gewalt im Reich auf Göring also überging und er also eigentlich dann damit also eben als
This, of course, set off a massive reaction immediately. And given that the relationship between Göring and himself had been deteriorating over the years, he made the final cut.
Das Verhältnis zwischen Göring und ihm sowieso im Laufe der Jahre sehr abgeschwächt hatte.
He stripped Göring of all his offices and ordered the Gestapo to arrest him. He said that Göring was not to see the end of the war alive.
Ihn zu verhaften und auch mit dem Auftrag, dass Göring das Ende des Krieges nicht überleben sollte.
For the time being, Hitler's omnipotence was sustained. Göring was fortunate to save his life by surrendering himself to the Americans. However, he quickly realized that the victors had no intention of treating the Nazi leaders as equals. He was arrested, tried at Nuremberg some months later, and sentenced to death in 1946. Göring escaped death by hanging by committing with a potassium cyanide capsule. (24th of April 1945. Only 2 days after Hitler's breakdown, confidence had returned to the Führer bunker. While outside, road after road of the city fell to the Soviets, Hitler continued to pin his hopes on an army unit which was 60 kilometers away and approaching Berlin. The 12th Army, under the command of General Walter Wenck, would bring about change, exulted Hitler. The last contingents of the Führer's army in the burning city had entrenched themselves for the final defense. Waffen-SS snipers on rooftops were picking off Red Army soldiers. Wehrmacht soldiers were trying to hold the superior enemy with machine guns. Adolescent Hitler youth boys were firing bazookas from cellar windows and bomb craters.
We were apparently waiting for a brigade from Königsberg. I can't understand to this day how on earth a unit from Königsberg could possibly reach us, since the Russians had already encircled the city. You see, this would be Königsberg here, Pomerania in between, and here would be the mudflats. There were some radio messages from somewhere about reinforcements under General Wenck and General Steiner being on the way, but they all proved wrong.
The attack on Berlin was filmed by 40 Soviet cameramen working under director Uli Reisman. Risking their lives, they captured the Red Army advance into the city, which was met with fanatical resistance time and again. In order to strengthen the morale of Berlin's citizens, Propaganda Minister Goebbels had handbills distributed which contained an appeal to the soldiers of the 12th Army. Soldiers of General Wenck's army, an order of greatest consequence has removed you from your deployment against our Western enemies and taken you marching toward the East. Your orders are clear. Berlin has to remain German. The message of your rapid advance has given the defenders of the Reich capital new heart to fight with more defiance and determination, in the faith that they will soon hear the thunder of your guns. The Führer has called you, and you have commenced your assault, as in our days of victory. Berlin is expecting you. Berlin is longing for you with an eager heart.
Die Atmosphäre in dem Bunker war beklommen.
The atmosphere in the bunker was full of apprehension. Everyone was scared. One could feel that the worst was imminent. The Russians were advancing further and further into Berlin. But there were also phases during which one believed that not everything was lost yet. And then there was hope for a while.
Dann flammte also wieder die Hoffnung wieder hoch, dann also wieder abzusinken. Und ein besonderes Ereignis war,
For me and most of the others who were in the bunker, one such time was when we learnt of the rapid advance of General Wenck's 12th Army, which, to my surprise, seemed to have the situation under control.
Also obgleich die militärische Lage nur wirklich gut im Griff hatte, die es schafften, also doch bis nach einem
They had managed to press forward to a place called Fech, 12 kilometers southeast of Potsdam, just 20 kilometers away from the center of Berlin.
Ungefähr vorzudringen, dass die das geschafft hatten. Das gab noch einmal einen
The
kolossalen
fact that they had got so close gave the people in the bunker a huge boost in morale. Suddenly one saw happier faces again, but it only lasted for a short while. Then came the news that Wenck's men could not hold their positions. They had come under attack by the troops of Marshal Konev from the south and had begun to retreat. It was a heavy blow, of course, and all the hopes that had budded for a while were crushed again. People knew it was the last chance. After that, it was definitely over.
Hoffnungen also wieder in sich zusammensanken und man nun eigentlich sah, das war noch eine letzte Chance gewesen. Nun ist es definitiv aus.
The hope for Wenck's army and the news that Hitler had taken on the supreme command in the impending battle gave many people in the city a new lift. Around midday on the 25th of April, the Red Army had Berlin under siege. There still existed, however, several gaps in the ring for the next few days. Conditions in the city were becoming chaotic. In some districts, the food and water supplies had broken down. The people barricaded in Hitler's bunker were largely unaware of this. Here, supplies were abundant.
Die Reichskanzlei war an sich reich bestückt, also mit großen Vorräten. Sie stammten ja von besseren Zeiten her, wo eben dort große Empfänge und so weiter waren.
The Chancellery of the Reich was actually very well stocked. The supplies were from better days, from when they were having grand receptions and the like.
Mengen von Alkoholika eben.
Consequently, there were huge amounts of alcohol available, and food too.
Wir hatten also nie irgendwelche Sorge, dass wir irgendwie zu
We were never concerned that the food supplies would run short. Everything was there aplenty, not just the basics, but also all sorts of nice things. And my colleague Bolt and I always felt well looked after.
Eigentlich keine Zeit, also uns darum wirklich zu kümmern und waren aber eben, fühlten uns immer gut versorgt. Aber was eben dann doch passierte, war, dass die sonst ziemlich strengen
Initially,
Sitten
morals in the bunker were quite strict, especially in Hitler's vicinity. Smoking or drinking alcohol were not allowed.
geraucht und es wurde auch nicht getrunken. Und naja, er aß ja nur vegetarisch.
You see, he was a vegetarian, and he had his own chef there, Frau Manziali, who cooked vegetarian dishes for him, and everything was geared to his rather Spartan needs.
Ihn abgestellt und eher spartanisch, also an all diesen Dingen. Und da
What gradually happened, however, was that the morals loosened as we were confined there, so that many people turned to the alcohol available excessively.
dass eben viele Leute eben da auch eben sehr stark zu den vorhandenen Alkoholika eben griffen.
Hermann Fegelein was liaison officer to the Führer of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. Squad leader Fegelein won a privileged position with Hitler after he married Eva Braun's younger sister Gretel in early July 1944. Some people from the inner circle of the dictator believed that this was a calculated move by the ambitious SS officer. In the bunker, Fegelein drew attention primarily by his arrogant behavior and by momentous remarks about him not intending to die in Berlin. This reckless attitude was his undoing.
Ein ganz entscheidendes Schlusserlebnis war ja also dann Himmlers Verhandlungsbereitschaft gegenüber dem Westen über den Grafen Volk.
One crucial event that marked the imminent end was when Himmler's plan to negotiate with the West through Count Volker Bernadotte became known on the evening of the 28th of April. That was actually the final blow. From then on, Hitler became clearly aware that even his loyal Prussian, the man on whom he had counted the most, had now betrayed him.
Dass der also nun also auch Verrat beging, wie das also von ihm bezeichnet wurde.
To him, that was the event that marked the beginning of the end.
Jetzt an das Ende zu denken.
Although Hitler had never completely overcome his distrust even towards his closest confidant, he was very upset by the betrayal of his loyal Heinrich, the organizer of the Holocaust. On the evening of the 28th of April 1945, Himmler's secret negotiations with the West became known in the Führer's bunker. Hitler was incensed.
Der Fegelein hat mich aus der Stadt angerufen.
Fegelein called me from the city to ask how the situation in the bunker was. I told him on the telephone that I didn't know anything. I was only surprised that he called from outside, because he should normally be in the bunker. On the other hand, he would hardly ever show up at the bunker. He had an apartment in the city, and apparently there was also a woman involved and so on. But the people from the security service knew where he was.
Aber die Leute vom Sicherheitsdienst, die wussten, wo war.
Da wurden vom Bereichssicherheitsdienst Leute hingeschickt in seiner Wohnung.
Some officers from the Reich security service were sent to his apartment to meet him. He was not supposed to be arrested, and their orders were to summon him to the bunker for a briefing.
Ihn aufzufordern, zur Besprechung zu kommen. Und nein, lehnte ab.
But he refused to go with them. I heard that from the people who were there in his apartment. Why should I come in? He told them, it's all over anyway. When the officers came back and reported to Martin Bormann in my presence, he reprimanded them sharply and told them to go back at once and arrest Fegelein.
Recht scharf zurechtgewiesen, sofort hinfahren, Fegelein verhaften.
Ich mochte den Fegelein nicht, das war ein Filou.
I didn't like Fegelein, he was a rogue. But still, I didn't understand why he was supposed to stay until the end. What he did was only human. He had just married, his wife, Eva's sister, was expecting a baby, and he was Eva's brother-in-law. Well, I was hoping that Hitler would understand, that he'd say it was a human reaction. Especially knowing that it was over. I don't understand why he didn't.
Ich hab's eigentlich nicht verstanden.
In reality, Hermann Fegelein was arrested 2 days before Himmler's treason. He allegedly called his sister-in-law from his apartment in the Charlottenburg district before his arrest, wanting to persuade her to flee from the bunker. Rumor had it that Eva Braun was fonder of Fegelein than her own sister.
Dann ist vor ein Standgericht also eben gestellt worden.
Then he came before a court where he must have admitted that he knew of Himmler's treason, so he was sentenced to death. I did see him one more time. I was sitting together with Bolt in my bunker room. The door to the main corridor, where everyone who was coming or going went past, was open. And I saw Fegelein being led away by 4 SS soldiers, 2 in front and 2 behind him.
Und da sah ich also, wie erstmal 2 SS-Soldaten kamen und dahinter der Fegelein. Und ich sah, dass ihm also die Schulterstücke...
I saw that his epaulettes and decorations had been torn off, and it was clear that they were taking him to be executed.
Und dahinter nochmal 2 SS-Leute dahinter und wie von denen abgeführt wurde. Es war klar, also das war, also, dass er dann eben erschossen wurde.
Ein gewisser, den Namen nenne ich nicht.
Someone whose name I'm not going to mention shot him from behind with a machine gun in the hallway of the new Chancellery.
Der neuen Reichskanzlei erschossen.
On that night began the final act of the drama in the Führer bunker. At 2 o'clock in the morning of the 29th of April, Hitler called for his secretary, Traudl Junge.
Da hat gesagt, haben Sie ein bisschen Geduld, kommen Sie doch bitte nebenan, ich möchte was diktieren. Da habe ich das Gefühl gehabt, jetzt kommt der Augenblick der Wahrheit. Jetzt werd ich als Erste und Einzige erfahren.
He said, "Have you calmed down a bit? Come over here, please. I have something to dictate to you." I had the feeling that this was the moment of truth, that I would be the first and only person to learn why everything was coming to an end and why this disaster had come about. I actually thought that Hitler would use words of apology for everything that had gone wrong. So I was shocked and aghast to realize that this will was basically just a repetition of the old slogans. He said plainly that National Socialism would end with him, but then he still appointed a successor government. I found it all deeply unsettling as he was dictating it.
Even during the days of his downfall, Hitler demanded that the nation scrupulously uphold the racial laws and, quote, offer relentless resistance to international Jewry.
I remember him sitting at the table with his hands resting on it while he dictated. He dictated this text in a monotonous voice, with an expressionless face and without faltering. He hesitated little. His speech was actually very fluent, both during the private and the political will. It was plain to see in his body posture and his facial expression that he had no more life in him. His eyes, which had been so intense in former days, were lifeless. It was evident that he was a man without hope.
As long as Hitler saw a future for himself, he had not wanted to marry Eva Braun. There was only room for Germany in his life. Now he didn't need to show consideration for his country any longer.
On that day, Eva Braun said something very strange. She told me, "Today you will have tears in your eyes." I thought the time had come, because she had always said that the Führer would let her know when the day had come that he would take his own life. And then she said, "Oh no, it's not that." What she meant was that she knew they would get married on that day.
The document of the marriage ceremony has survived. The bride had almost signed as Eva Braun, but caught herself just in time and used her new name.
When she came back after having signed her name under the marriage contract, there were people lined up to offer their congratulations. I was one of them too. Then, a smaller circle went into Hitler's office to have a glass of sparkling wine and celebrate the wedding, but I wasn't there. I remember that all the aides who had addressed her as Miss or Miss Braun up until then suddenly had to address her as Mrs. Hitler, and many of them had trouble with it.
Die mussten plötzlich noch Frau Hitler sagen. Und ich weiß gar nicht, kann mich gar nicht erinnern. Ich glaube, das hat manchen gewisse Schwierigkeiten noch gemacht.
During the early hours of the 29th of April 1945, the Red Army began their assault on the center of Berlin. The troops of Marshal Zhukov were advancing from Kreuzberg towards Potsdamer Straße. A German officer described the scene in his diary. Increasing signs of disbanding and despair, but there's no point. We cannot capitulate at the last minute and regret not to have held out for the rest of our lives. They said that in the Chancellery, one is more firmly convinced of the final victory than ever before. Our physical condition is beyond description. No relief and no peace. No regular food rations, just a bit of bread. Nervous breakdowns under the unrelenting artillery fire. Water is pumped from wells and from the river. Treatment for the walking wounded is almost non-existent. The civilians are afraid of taking wounded soldiers and officers in their cellars. Too many were hung for desertion, either genuine or alleged. Mobile military courts turn up all the time, especially today, mainly consisting of very young SS officers. Hardly any decorations, blind and fanatical. The hope for relief and the fear of the courts makes the men pull themselves together time after time. At noon on the 29th of April, the front line was only approximately 400 meters away from the Chancellery of the Reich. Hitler's officers believed the dictator had only a few hours left.
Es war klar, jetzt gibt es keine Linien mehr.
It was obvious that there were no longer any lines. There were no options left. The final hours had begun. Hitler knew that these final hours would end with his death. He knew that what he may always have tried to suppress and postpone was now becoming serious, that the time had come to take the poison capsule from the cupboard and keep it in his pocket.
Sich also die Cyankali-Kapsel in die Hosentasche zu stecken.
The combat commander of Berlin, General Helmut Weidling, later remembered this 29th of April. If the Führer did not revoke his resolution to defend Berlin up to the last man, thus sacrificing everyone who lived and fought in this city for the sake of a mad idea, disaster was inevitable. We deliberated on the question of how one could change fate. The Führer would have to understand that even the most courageous soldier could not fight without ammunition. It was a pointless and unnecessary battle. According to estimates, over 100,000 people committed in the spring of 1945.
Eigentlich spielte sich das dann zum Schluss eigentlich alles so ab, dass die Leute sich nur überlegten,
At the end, all that people were actually worried about was, how do I kill myself? Do I use my gun to shoot myself, or do I take the capsule? These potassium cyanide capsules were widely available. I did not have one, but the higher-ranking officers had all obtained such capsules, of course, and it had become the main topic of discussion.
During their advance, Russian soldiers found more and more dead bodies. Often entire families are committed, their only way out of the crumbling Third Reich.
Service in dem Fall nicht schwer. Ich wollte mich wirklich.
Dying wasn't hard under those circumstances. In case of emergency, I really was prepared to kill myself too. I had my gun ready with the safety catch off. I was convinced that if it came down to it, I would shoot myself.
Das weiß ich genau.
On the one hand, I knew that this was probably the end, but on the other hand, something inside me was refusing to accept that I would die trapped in the bunker like a rat. I was racking my brains trying to think of some way to get out of there.
Und habe mir natürlich Gedanken gemacht, gibt es noch irgendeine Möglichkeit, irgendwie rauszukommen?
The Wehrmacht report of the 29th of April 1945 reads, "The fierce house-to-house fighting for the city center of Berlin raged throughout the day and night. Our courageous troops defended their positions in heavy battle against the incessantly attacking Bolshevik masses. Nonetheless, their advance could not be halted." As the army officers in the bunker had not received any news from General Wenck for days, some aides formed a bold plan to get out. They wanted to break through the Soviet lines and get in contact with Wenck.
Hitler hatte damals schon vollkommen abgeschlossen.
By then, Hitler had accepted his fate. He had given us the authorization and we reported to him, giving our notice of departure. It was at noon on the 29th, 24 hours before his death. He was extremely collected and talked with us for approximately half an hour about how we wanted to get out. He wanted us to explain our plan exactly. I told him that one possibility would be to go through Grunewald, through the front, which I considered nearly impossible because the front was already so interlocked that we would no longer be able to get through. And the other path, which we actually took, was to escape through the west of Berlin, a part that was defended by the Hitler Youth, reach the Havel, and use a boat at night to paddle towards Wannsee and Fraueninsel and escape from there.
In Richtung Wannsee, Fraueninsel, dann durchzupaddeln und dann zu verschwinden. Und da hat er sich also darüber dann noch eben mit uns unterhalten.
This was what we talked about. Then he had an idea. You should use an electric motorboat, you know, he said. And I thought to myself, oh, for God's sake, we might as well use a cruiser. His argument was that being electric, the boat wouldn't make any noise. But the Havel is about 2 kilometers wide down there, and making off on a boat 2 meters tall or more would certainly not be the right thing to do. However, I decided not to enter into a discussion with him about our escape boat, but I somehow had the impression he envied us. He saw 2 strong young men standing before him, and he probably thought that he was physically too, no longer in a position to even contemplate such an undertaking. It was all over for him.
Körperlich eben nicht mehr in der Lage, so ein Unternehmen überhaupt ernsthaft, also sich zu überlegen, und dass für ihn das alles aus wäre.
While the Red Army was advancing ever closer to the Chancellery, army officials in the bunker lost the overview altogether. The commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht and his generals did not know what was happening at the fronts, as the contact of the Supreme Command was cut off. A little later, a radio message came from General Jodl. He expected Wenck's 12th Army to be near Potsdam. For one last time, hopes were raised in the bunker. Aide Freytag von Loringhoven found out what happened then only much later.
Dann hätte plötzlich wieder das Planen begonnen und man hätte überlegt, ja, wer ist denn noch
Suddenly they started making plans again. They were counting their options, who was still available that could help. First of all, we have Wenck's army, then we have Schörner's army group in the south in Silesia, which so far has only been attacked on its left wing, so it can still be activated. There is also another group under Holster and one under Steiner. What they were basically planning was to reactivate this conglomerate of worn-out and broken-up troop units and have them stage an attack in order to relieve Berlin.
Aktiviert werden zu einem Angriff zur Entlastung von Berlin.
Chief of Operations General Alfred Jodl received Hitler's radio message at 2300 hours. Only 1 hour later, it became obvious that a Wehrmacht advance toward Berlin would no longer be possible. The situation their Führer was in during his final days had become inconsequential to most Germans. A woman from Berlin wrote in her diary,
"The war has eliminated all. This is the end of civilization. It is horrific.
A makeshift military hospital had been stationed in the basement of the Chancellery for weeks. The staff consisted of SS Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk, who had formerly conducted medical experiments on concentration camp inmates, SS Dr. Werner Hase, and some nurses.
Am 29. April, da wurden wir aufgefordert, in den Führerbunker zu kommen, weil Hitler
On the 29th of April, we were called into the Führer's bunker. Hitler wanted to thank us, the two nurses, Hase and me, for having worked there. Hitler came up from the lower bunker, and I saw him from above, from a distance of maybe 1 or 2 meters, and was appalled. He didn't look human anymore. He was beyond the threshold. At that time, I understood that everything was over, everything lost. One of the nurses, shocked to see him like that, said, "Heil, mein Führer, we will follow you until death," and so on. And then he just said with a shaky voice, one should not desire to cowardly avoid one's own fate. Turned around and went back into his chambers. Some time later, I saw him again down there. I was coming back from the bathroom, and he was sitting there together with Hase at a table in the small corridor. There I noticed for the first time this Parkinson-like tremor he had. His leg was wrapped around the table leg and was shaking badly. Hase was demonstrating the rapid effects of hydrocyanic acid to him on Blondie, Hitler's favorite Alsatian. He stuffed a capsule into her mouth and crushed it in order to show Hitler how quickly the dog died. To be certain, you must insert a capsule of hydrocyanic acid into your mouth and bite it. And at the same time, you bite the capsule, fire the gun too. Then you can be sure that if the bullet doesn't kill you, the poison certainly will.
Die Situation, als Hitler Selbstmord geplant und dann ausgeführt hat, die war so extrem.
The situation in the bunker when Hitler planned and then committed to suicide was intense. It was like an unreal world, as if people were in a state of shock, where normal emotions no longer existed. I had the feeling we were all moving like puppets. Everyone seemed to have accepted it and coped with it outwardly. But I think we all had to fight with our fears and worries.
Ich glaube, es hat doch jeder mit seiner Angst und mit seiner Sorge gekämpft.
The Chancellery had been under continuous Soviet artillery shelling since 5 o'clock in the morning. The Red Army were only 100 meters away. Down in the bunker, Armin Lehmann met the Führer and his last trusty followers one final time.
We could hear the shells exploding above us on the ground. Then one struck us and some plaster came off the wall. Hitler didn't seem to see me at all. He was sitting staring to space. And then he muttered something like, I didn't quite understand, I think it sounded like another hit.
Und das kann ich nicht hundertprozentig sagen, das ist richtig, aber es hörte sich so an, als wieder ein Treffer.
The mood in the room was very much as if the world was about to end.
Das war schon eine Weltuntergangsatmosphäre. Eva Braun, sie bot mir dann ein Glas Sprudel an. Und das Glas war ganz feucht.
Then Eva Braun offered me a glass of mineral water. The glass was wet, and my hands were dirty, so it slipped, fell to the floor and smashed. I was really embarrassed, but she said it doesn't matter and gave me a new glass. It's horrible what's going on out there, she said. Mrs. Goebbels looks as if she's been crying. You can tell that she's really sad.
Sie in einem traurigen Zustand.
At 3:45 in the afternoon on the 30th of April 1945, and while Soviet tanks were approaching the Reichstag and hundreds of German soldiers were still dying a senseless death in house-to-house fighting, Hitler put an ignominious end to his life in the Chancellery of the Reich, 8 meters below the ground.
Es war Kirchenstille, Mäuschenstill. Jeder sprach nur ganz
It was
leise.
dead quiet. Everyone was speaking in hushed tones, merely whispering. And then, as I was ready to go, someone called Linger, Linger. Linger was his personal servant. I think it's time. Linger and an aide called Günscher were down there, and they waited for quite a while. I could feel the fear creeping up inside me. So I stayed, and then the door opened. I don't know who it was who opened it, Günscher or Linger, one of them.
Günscher oder Linger, einer von den beiden. Tür auf.
As the door swung open, I was just 2 or 3 meters away, and of course I looked in. Then the next person went in, and as the door opened again, and we went through, I saw Hitler sunken next to the couch. Or maybe he was next to the armchair beside the couch. I'm not 100% sure. And I also saw Eva Braun lying there with her knees drawn up, in the dark blue dress and with white frills. I remember that clearly.
At a later point, the victors recorded in pictures the bunker and its facilities. What exactly took place in Hitler's living room remains unclear. It's possible that it was the servant Heinz Linger who gave his master the coup de grâce. The events that followed are indisputable.
I
still have a very clear picture in my mind of how Linger, Günscher and someone from the security service whom I didn't know wrapped Hitler's body in a blanket on the floor.
Einwickeln in die Decke. Und dann sagte mein Kamerad.
Then I was told to go and report to the commander, and I left and told Schindler what had happened.
Den Kommandochef gesagt, was passiert ist.
The Führer is dead. They're taking him outside. When? He asked. And I said, right now, as we speak. Comrade Retzbach is standing in for me. Then it's okay, he said. You can go back to your post. So I went back to Retzbach and he told me, the Führer is being cremated. Are you going up? And I said, no.
The bodies were not to fall into the hands of the Russians, yet the location where the improvised cremation took place did not remain secret for long.
There was fresh earth piled up where they'd been interred and something that looked like an arm, which could have been a piece of metal, and there was smoke coming out of it. The guard who came from the other tower recognized it immediately and said, this is where they're buried.
Wachposten, der vom anderen Turm rauskam, der machte dann eine Bemerkung, dort liegen die begraben.
These images of the garden of the Chancellery were filmed in early July 1945. A few jerry cans that held the fuel for the burning were still lying around, but the provisional grave of Adolf and Eva Hitler was empty. 4 days after taking the Chancellery, Soviet Secret Service officers found the area in the garden. First, they stumbled upon the carcass of Blondie the dog, and later they dug out the charred bodies of the Führer and his wife. They were positively identified by means of their dental work. The remains disappeared for decades in the safekeeping of the KGB. The ashes were not removed for good until 1970. 1st of May 1945. Soldiers on both sides were still unaware that the man who had caused all the misery and suffering had shirked his responsibilities by committing suicide. Only as late as 10:30 at night was the news of Adolf Hitler's death broadcast on the radio. By then, the Red Army had reached Unter den Linden, Berlin's formerly magnificent avenue. Fighting was still going on inside the Reichstag. The end of the battle was just a matter of hours away. Not far from here, in the bunker beneath the Chancellery of the Reich, it was all falling apart on that 1st of May. Two small groups, including party leader Martin Bormann, aide Otto Günscher, and secretary Traudl Junge, had decided to try and escape through the Soviet lines. Those less confident either shot themselves following the example of their Führer, or bit into a potassium cyanide capsule. The new Reich Chancellor, Joseph Goebbels, offered Stalin a peace proposal shortly after Hitler's death, but it was rejected within hours. The Goebbels government only lasted one day. In view of the imminent consequences, Goebbels and his wife decided to put a perverse end to their lives.
Frau Goebbels kam da ungefähr 18 Uhr.
Mrs. Goebbels came down at about 6 or 7 p.m. She got the children ready, combed their hair and so on, was talking to them about Uncle Adolf.
Und ihnen da erzählt und so weiter von Onkel Adolf.
Pictures from better days. Magda Goebbels gave the propaganda minister 6 children. They had to die too, according to the will of their parents. In a letter to her son from her first marriage, Magda Goebbels rationalized the murder.
Our wonderful idea is perishing, and with it everything beautiful, admirable, noble and decent I have known in my life.
Wir haben überhaupt keine Vorstellung gehabt, wie das Leben weitergeht und ob es überhaupt weitergehen kann.
We had no conception as how life would go on, or even whether it could go on at all. To me, it was like an abyss over which I could not see beyond. And I assumed that it was a lot more serious for the Goebbels. They could presumably not imagine their children growing up in a time that was not shaped by National Socialism, or in a Germany that lay in ruins.
Magda Goebbels continued in her letter,
"This is the reason why I brought the children here. They are too good for the life that is coming to us, and the merciful God will understand me for giving them redemption myself."
Als die Kinder weg waren, irgendwann.
Sometime after the children had left, I said to Dr. Naumann, "It's terrible, really terrible." He shrugged his shoulders and said that if it were up to him, and then he pointed to where Goebbels was, then the children would not be there anymore. Dr. Strumpfer was giving them something to drink, some sweetened water, and that was the end of them.
for most soldiers the war was over, Reich Chancellor Joseph Goebbels sat chain-smoking in the Führer bunker, hoping for a miracle. He regularly inquired about the military situation. Then he finally realized that the Soviets had almost reached the garden of the Chancellery.
Dann kam er und sagt, was haben wir denn noch? Dann habe ich ihm erklärt, General Bayernfänger.
He would come out and say, have we got anything? And I would pass him the information. General Bauernfänger, some people from the Gau administration and individual people who still called and asked for help. After I'd finished my update, Goebbels would say, well, it's not very much, is it? And then he would go away again, silent, and I would get back to work, although I wanted to leave.
Wieder ich Gespräche gehabt, wieder gearbeitet. Ja, bis dann doch kam, denn ich wollte ja auch weg, bis mir dann gesagt hat.
After a few such dialogues, he then came out again and said to me, if we know how to live, then we will also know how to die. You can finish now. So I pulled out all the cables. I was relieved I could finally get away.
Ich war erlöst, jetzt konnte ich abhauen.
Magda and Joseph Goebbels committed suicide on the evening of the 1st of May in the garden of the Chancellery. Shortly afterward, the Red Army occupied the bunker without any resistance. The bodies of the Goebbels family were lined up for the Soviet cameramen. They became symbols for the fatal fanaticism that cost 55 million human lives and did not even spare one's own children. On the 2nd of May, Red Army soldiers and slave laborers liberated from tyranny celebrated the victory. Berlin's garrison had capitulated unconditionally. The Chancellery was deserted. There was hardly anything left to testify to the dramatic events of the previous days. The victors conducted a painstaking inspection of Hitler's semi-destroyed center of power. The combat commander of Berlin, General Helmut Weidling, had to present himself for Soviet propaganda purposes to his defeated soldiers, who were now taken prisoner with him. The general had formulated the capitulation order with the following cynical words. On the 30th of April, the Führer committed suicide, thus deserting all those who had sworn loyalty to him. Loyal to the orders of the Führer, you, German soldiers, were prepared to continue the battle for Berlin, despite having very little ammunition, and despite the overall situation which rendered resistance senseless. I command the immediate suspension of all resistance. Every hour the fighting continues prolongs the terrible suffering of both the civilian population and our wounded. In agreement with the Supreme Command of the Soviet troops, I am ordering you to cease fighting immediately. Two and a half months later, the Soviet sector of Berlin was decorated with the symbols of the victors on the occasion of the Potsdam Conference. Not far from the capital, Stalin, Churchill, and the new US President Truman were discussing the future of Germany. The Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and the director of the secret police Beria drove across Berlin in an open-top Mercedes. The tour of the high-ranking delegation ended at the ruins of the Chancellery of the Reich. The highlight of the inspection was the bunker in which Hitler took his own life. Nothing had remained of him, declared the Soviets to the world. In reality, however, the remains of Hitler and his wife had been stowed away in the court exhibit room of the Soviet Secret Service in Moscow, where they've been kept for nearly 60 years. On the second floor of the notorious Lubyanka prison, officers of the Domestic Secret Service, FSB, present the trophies taken from the bunker of the Führer. The director of the Central Archives, Nikolai Machaikin, carefully opens some old cigarette packs.
This here is the irrefutable proof that the body we found was in fact Adolf Hitler's. Every forensic pathologist in the world will confirm that these are Hitler's authentic dental samples. These here are from Eva Braun, and these are the dentures of Magda Goebbels.
Joseph Goebbels too left an unmistakable trophy for the victors.
Everyone knows that Joseph Goebbels had an anatomical defect, a club foot. One of his legs was shorter than the other, and he therefore wore an artificial appliance, this one here. So we were able to identify Goebbels' remains beyond a doubt.
The uniforms from the wardrobe of the Führer are also draped for the camera. Then they disappear once again, safely packed in the archives, just like their former owner, another dark relic of history.